Thank you, Ralph. I'm John Banister. I'm the Deputy East Coast Editor with Bisnow. We're a commercial real estate news and events company. And, you know, this is a really interesting topic right now, and it has been since the start of the pandemic. You know, it's been more than 3 years since COVID started, and we're still seeing all these headlines around companies, you know, trying to get their employees back into the office. And, you know, occupancy levels are still less than 50% nationwide. And, you know, it seems like employers have been, for the last 3 years, trying a variety of different strategies and policies around bringing people back and sort of trying to make the office a place where they want to be, trying to entice people to come into the office. The pandemic has also changed office leasing demand and, you know, led tenants to seek newer space, and it's put a lot of these older buildings in a tough position. So we're going to get into all this stuff, but first I want to let the panelists here introduce themselves. So Amber, go ahead.
Hi everyone, my name is Amber Schiada. I am head of our America's Work Dynamics and Industry Research Platform at JLL. JLL is a big commercial real estate company, and we do all kinds of things as it relates to leasing, transacting, and advising our clients on their real estate strategies. And my role is, as I said, lead research is just trying to find answers to what's going on with all the trends today. So I'm excited to talk to you about what we're seeing with the operator.
Yes, Rob.
Yeah, my name is Scott Ziegler. I'm the head of Ziegler Group of Architects. I head up their practice area leader for what I call our urban architecture studio, which designs office buildings, high-rise, mid-rise residential, and retail, hotels all across the sidewalk. I have the good fortune of getting paid to help other people dream, and still enjoy coming to work every day.
Thank you, guys. So Amber, I want to start with you. You know, your team does a lot of research into office occupiers and their workplace plans. Where are we right now in this return to office push coming out of the pandemic? What are some of the challenges you're seeing today that companies are having in bringing their people back?
So it's been 3 years since the pandemic started, and luckily that's mostly behind us, it seems like. But what's happened in the last 3 years is that the way that people work and the way that we expect to work has shifted dramatically. We know, because office workers were able to go home and work from home, that works. At the beginning of the pandemic, productivity actually increased. I think for a number of reasons. One, people were probably worried about working from home and making sure that they looked productive. But there was also this sort of technological advancement. You know, everyone was using Zoom, all these things that enabled remote work, right? So 3 years later, companies are really struggling to get their employees back to the office and incentivizing that return because there's this huge mindset shift that's happened. People know that they can work remote, they know that it works, and I think that they've also come to enjoy some of the flexibility that remote work offers, you know, especially as it relates to work-life balance with your families, with childcare. That was a huge issue during the pandemic. And so if you're a CEO today, your big challenge is trying to figure out how do you get people back to the office. Are we starting to see any concerns around productivity? The answer is yes. Is it because people are working remote? And a lot of CEOs would think so, but because there's been such this mindset shift, and because people have just come to expect this flexibility, it's really hard to get people back. And I think the number one sort of detriment that people name typically is the commute. I don't want to spend 12 hours a week in my car or the subway, especially now. And when I get there, like, if I'm on Zoom calls all day, it's really productive. So I think that we're probably, if I were going to put it in baseball innings, I'd probably say that we're in the 7th inning of kind of figuring out what that return to work and sort of hybrid reality looks like. Because again, you've got employees that have this expectation, you've got CEOs that are trying to figure out what is going to be the carrot that gets people back, and there isn't one size fits all. So we're still kind of now in that phase where companies are implementing and really, you know, solidifying those workplace strategies, but implementation and the success of those strategies is still in question.
Yeah, you mentioned productivity, and I'm curious, like, how are companies measuring that, or how are they evaluating, you know, their employees when they're in the office versus when they're at home, and measuring like their policies and how they're working out?
It kind of depends on the company. So a lot of large tech companies will look at patent applications as one way to measure their success. And actually, we've seen patent counts decline across the US in the last couple of years, actually the last 2 years. And some question, is this a mark of productivity loss? There's also, the BLS puts out a metric on productivity, so if you look at business and professional services, there's actually been a decline in this cycle in terms of business output. And if you look at the last 3 cycles, the great financial crisis, the savings and loan crisis, the dot-com, productivity came back at a pretty similar rate, and we're kind of seeing that drop off a bit. So there's a lot of different ways to measure it. There actually isn't a really a singular way to look at that. Some companies will even look at sales. And we've seen some office decisions being made due to, if there's a really strong sales office, company will likely keep that office, and they might look at other offices as maybe disposing of that. So there's a lot of different ways. There's not really one size fits all, but it's kind of that elusive metric that I think all employees are trying to measure.
That's interesting. Scott, I want to go to you. Since the pandemic started, there have been a variety of office, design changes and different elements incorporated into the office and amenity spaces and services. Have you seen any of these prove successful? Do you think, what's moving the needle on bringing employees back?
Well, we've seen all kinds of different remedies to bring people back. I'm not sure any of them are all working together. But in the initial phase, the clients who come to us who own buildings or corporate people come to us and ask us to put in WeWork type facilities where it's a relaxed work environment with a hospitality feel, with a lot of collaboration spaces, amenities like barista bars and food service and fitness and health and wellness. It didn't really work very well. From there, they came back and started increasing the ante and offered the employees a chance to do hybrid work where they come in 1-2 days a week and then or 3 days a week and take Monday and Friday off. That's not working either. So what we're finding is that the work cultures are suffering, and I think the work cultures in corporate America are in desperate need of getting people back to collaborate as a family of people that believe in the business strategy, the business mindset. And you can't do that remotely. To train the next leadership structure for any firm, small or large, you need people to collaborate and share ideas and train. Training by Zoom or training by Microsoft Teams is not a good solution. So what we're seeing is actually some interesting hybrid models. We do a lot of high-rise urban residential as well as high-rise office buildings, but the new high-rise office buildings are not really the solution because you're not going to build it. But we're seeing a lot of co-working space now coming to our urban residential projects.
We were talking in the green room about the role of executive management. I mean, what do you think leaders of companies should be doing differently to bring more people back to the office?
Well, when we were talking in the green room, I think they need to get some labels and tell their employees that they hire them to work 40 hours a week and get back to the office. I think they've been very timid, and I think they need to take a little more hard line. We've seen a few CEOs do that, and I think it's having some impact, but it's still not there yet.
Amber, do you want to touch on that?
Yeah, we've, I think that there's, as I mentioned earlier, this is the mindset shift of the workforce. I think there is a stronger desire to have support for wellness and health, like you mentioned, whether that means benefits that support that or if that's flexibility in your time. I think there's, certainly employees want more of that. They want to work in a place that sort of enables that and offers that, and sort of the real estate has to support that as well. But I do think the leadership has been a challenge because even though there may be a CEO mandate that we're going to have everybody back in the office 5 days a week, the implementation of that has been the challenge. Employees certainly come to expect this flexibility, so to get that shift to turn the tide the other way has been really, really tough because now those expectations are there. And I think you've seen, there's been articles about some of the pushback at some of these larger tech companies. The mandate is that you come in, 3-4 days a week, and employees are like, I don't want to do that. Like, you've seen protests and walkouts, so clearly there's a disconnect there, but I think it's, rather than just the mandate, it's almost like employees need a reason or a purpose or something more. And whether or not that's, good or bad, I think that that is sort of the nature of the narrative right now. And the biggest challenge has been that the labor market is still very, very tight. We still have historically low unemployment. So even though the narrative is shifting and we've seen a ton of layoffs in the last few months, it still is the case that we are sort of, at this impasse where you've got employee expectations on one side, you've got CEO expectations on the other, and they're really not really meeting in the middle yet. So I've seen companies that have been more successful in implementing that return to office strategy have been companies that still offer some of that flexibility, but they have a very strong mandate from leadership all the way down that's implemented and followed through on, and that is probably the biggest challenge today.
I think if I could add to that, I think it's really a combination of that flexible work environment, but also leadership to motivate your people to be a part of the family and work culture and make them feel a part of that work culture. That is probably the biggest motivation. Everyone likes to feel like they belong to a winning cause, and if you can create that work culture with a winning cause, I think people will come back.
Scott, I want to touch on the so-called flight to quality. This is a term I heard before the pandemic began, but it's something that I think has been accelerated. As tenants, may not need quite as many square feet as they did before. They can consolidate into the newer, higher-end buildings to try to make, their employees want to come in more. How is that trend changing the way you're designing offices? What types of, design strategies are you using to attract that flight to quality?
Well, the flight to quality is real. I think we have overabundance of B-class buildings that are technologically obsolete, whether it's their technology within the building for just Wi-Fi and that technology, or it's the mechanical systems that are not meeting the green building standards. Those buildings are really, I don't think ever going to come back. But for the quality buildings, they're in quality locations in districts that offer more than just a place to work. It's a place to play, a place to eat, a place to exercise, a place to enjoy the culture of the city. So we're seeing buildings that will now be offering outdoor terraces for their employees, or outdoor rooftop garden areas, places. So.
Take that.
Barista bars, places where people can casually work, informal co-working spaces within the office. People get tired of sitting at a desk all day. They need to get up and stretch and relax and move around. So getting more natural light in the building, not having private offices on the interior all the way to the interior where there's no natural light. Making actually, most of the offices we're designing now are actually more square feet per employee than they were before the pandemic, because you have the private offices or their workstation, and you have these public gaming spaces.
So we've actually seen a similar trend, and it sounds counterintuitive that the square footage per employee might be going up, but if you think about how many of your employees are typically remote now as well, there's some of that ratio is shifting, but what we've also seen is that the floor plates are shrinking. So like you said, we've seen, demand has shrunk a little bit. They're consolidating their real estate spend into higher quality space, but having maybe a smaller footprint. We just did a study that looked at this over the last 3 years, and the office build-outs for clients that we work with have declined by about 11%, but they've increased the amount of space for collaboration space, for health and wellness space, mother's rooms, things that will enable the return to work to be a little bit more conducive to sort of that flexibility that you need when you're in the office. I think the biggest challenge we've seen is that a lot of people are on Zoom calls all day or WebEx calls, and the way that we work has changed in the last 3 years, so our office spaces aren't necessarily conducive to what we need in that sort of digital, physical realm that we live in now. And I can say the same is true in my own office in downtown LA. Everybody's on calls all day, and we have a very open office plan because it was designed pre-pandemic, and it's not great when everyone's yelling in the corridor,
Yeah. And you touched on the square footage loss, the reduction of footprints. I'm curious, have you done any research on how that breaks down by the sector of the office market? What types of companies are giving back the most space, and are there any that are expanding?
Expanding, probably not so many expanding right now, but we are seeing the consolidation prove out in the data. What's interesting is tech companies expanded quite a bit in 21 and part of 2022, but they are the sector that we're starting to see more of the subleases come on the market right now, because it was almost sort of this accelerated demand for talent and making sure they have the right square footage. And now that there's a little bit of a correction going on, I think there's a little bit of a consolidation space and creating efficiency with your footprint. But the banking sector, for example, they've been on a sort of steady consolidation trend for probably the last 15 years, if we're being honest. And the pandemic actually, for banks that were looking to either expand or consolidate space, they used that leverage as, a tenant that had some demand during the pandemic to take on some of the higher quality spaces. So a lot of the upgrades to higher quality spaces that we've seen during the last 2 or 3 years have been by those banking and finance clients, but they may have a smaller footprint. So we've seen about an 8% decline in terms of the top 25 bank occupiers in the last 3 years, about an 8% increase among tech occupiers, the top 25 tech occupiers, but again, that's kind of starting to slow down a little bit. So it's been pretty steady around 5 to 10% consolidation in the last 3 years across all sectors.
That's interesting. And Scott, when we spoke earlier, you mentioned some of the changes in lease terms around that have been caused by the pandemic. But what are you seeing in terms of leases and the agreements that the tenants are looking for in today's market?
It's actually pretty startling. For the last 30, 40 years, standard lease terms are usually in that 5 to 7 year range. And the recent numbers I've heard, you probably support that, but I've heard that the average lease term now is 3 years, which is startling. It shows the cautiousness of the end user not wanting to overcommit. They're still trying to figure out what this hybrid schedule means and what the co-working means and remote working and how it's going to play out. But when you just do the economics of that, every time you renew a lease, you get a build-out out there, you get some kind of rent break, hopefully, especially in today's market. So by the time you move in and spend a year and a half, you're renewing your new lease, so it's going to put a devaluation factor on all the commercial office space, which is just going to exacerbate the problem we already have.
Right. Obviously, owners would rather have longer-term leases so they can finance and sell their buildings, but it seems like tenants obviously have more leverage in the market, right? So they're able to successfully demand those shorter lease terms, you're saying?
Yes.
I think so, yeah, and I think it's really just the uncertainty. With the macro environment and the backdrop today, it's, I don't know how many people I'm going to have working remote or working at all for my company, so I want to make sure if I make a long-term commitment that it's really sound, and that is the challenge, and I think the uncertainty is the biggest risk in the market right now.
And you've touched on the impact of this on some of these older buildings. As tenants flee to the newer buildings and consolidate their footprints, there's millions of square feet of old buildings, in downtowns and suburbs that people don't really want to work in anymore, and that there's been a lot of tension around what's going to happen to those buildings. So I'm curious for both of you if you've seen examples of ways that owners can revive those buildings, or are there design changes, renovations that you can do to keep an office asset competitive, even if it's one of the older buildings? What have you seen there?
Well, I'll give you a couple of stories. One that just hit the market last week was interesting. There's a Houston developer over real estate in the REIT. 2 million square feet of office and retail space. I would say they've got to be in B-class space, not very good locations. The board of directors last week approved a plan to convert all of the office space and retail space into public storage, private storage space. Now, that's quite a bold move, going from 2 million square feet of office and retail to private storage. That's one. And the other is, we talked about this on the phone, but the idea of taking this get a call once every other week from someone who wants to convert an office building into a multi-family residential annex building.
So easy, right? Just
they're
add more rooms.
They're actually very naive. I mean, the fact of the matter matter is that office buildings have 3 times as many elevators and 3 times as many parking spaces as a residential building. So you end up with excess parking. I guess if you buy the building, it wouldn't cost that might make sense. But the office building elevators are of no use to you. So what do you do with that dead core space? And then the bones of an office building traditionally is a 40-foot bay depth to 45-foot bay depth, which is very unfriendly to a residential building. So the bones of the building are bad. And on top of that, you have to deconstruct the building, put balconies in, and reconstruct it with glass on it. So you're really double dipping on the construction costs. So about the only buildings that really make sense to do that are heritage buildings that have historical interest for a city, and someone who wants to put up a lot of dollars and probably won't be able to come out of it financially very well. But it's important for the city or for the owner of that building to maintain it for heritage reasons.
So have you seen examples of that where offices are, how much money does it take to bring a 50, 60-year-old office building up to the standards of tenants today? I mean, is there financing available to make those renovations?
Well, one of the ones we probably thought it was going to be a good idea to go get historical preservation dollars, and they just dug a bigger hole for themselves because the Historical Society had to take all the old windows out of this building, put them in the basement for preservation purposes, and then manufacture a little window. They cost them a bloody fortune. I would say you're probably easily 30 to 40% more costly to renovate and then rebuild, just tear it down. So the economics are not good.
It really depends on the asset. I mean, we've seen examples of conversions even before the pandemic. Like I mentioned, I live in Los Angeles, so in Koreatown, which is just adjacent to downtown, about 2 miles west, there is an old office corridor, the Wilshire District, that some office buildings are still tenanted. I don't know how much they're filled right now, but there have been several examples of apartment conversions. But again, it has to really be the right floor plate, and that's the challenge. Is not every building is going to have the bones required because of all the things that Scott mentioned. You've got to subdivide a square floor plate with core elevator in the middle. I mean, it's not conducive. Because there's also residential regulations with heat and window lines. You've got to have something to be a bedroom, it has to have certain fire code things, right? So it's not, it can be very expensive, but in a location where maybe it's very dense or maybe there's a huge need, for housing, there are certainly some options there. And I think what's going to sort of move the needle on conversions or open up more of those possibilities is having those cities support some of that and have sort of this public-private partnership. There has to, it can't just be on the investors or the developers because it is very expensive, but if cities want to sort of maintain, their tax bases and things like that, like thinking about ways to come to solutions to convert some of these office spaces, I mean, I think that's going to be paramount and probably one of the biggest issues we face in the next 10 years.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, the value proposition of these older office buildings. Before the pandemic, you would hear that there were a lot of tenants looking for just cheap office space. They wanted, low rents, their startups or whatever, where they weren't trying to pay the highest rent. I mean, do you still see that type of tenant in the market that's willing to rent older space because it's cheaper? And how much cheaper is it?
That's a good question. Yeah, I mean, I'm actually curious to hear what you think because of the co-working aspect. I think that has something to do with it, right? Where you've got, if you're going to have a cheap commodity office space, is it worth it to pay the money, or is it better to sort of have a shorter-term lease in a co-working space? And I think some of these smaller tenants that may have thought that in the past are kind of grappling with that. And if you think about just the office market, most of what was built in the last 50 years was built in the 70s and 80s and 90s, so it's like 55% of the market is kind of this older vintage, right? So if that market for that commodity space isn't as strong among the tenants, I mean, I would think that co-working is probably filling some of that void.
I'll throw in another curveball. We were asked by a landlord who has a commercial property setting on maybe several million square feet of office in a mixed-use environment where you actually have some other attributes to sell to your tenants. But they had 3 1982 vintage buildings, and I would call them B plus, A minus at best. And they asked us to come in and re-represent and to re-brand and refresh. So we took the approach of let's do the same thing we do for brand new office building in the public areas in the lobby for first impression. And they come back and they play with the technology we got. So we did all three buildings at the same time, and believe it or not, even during the construction, we did a lot of beautiful renderings. They were able to fully lease those three buildings, the 84 buildings, and in a Class A market.
Really, what types of tenants were leasing it?
Oil and gas, engineers.
Was it a number of small leases, or were
No,
there some big ones?
and simultaneously, we put up a 150,000 square foot brand new office building. They had a ceiling. So they were in the energy corridor, and energy's had a little bit of a rebound. So it's geographically important to know whether Class B building can make it or not.
Yeah, and I think the location is pretty
It's
great,
great.
yeah, because there's a lot of tired office space out there, but some of them are really good spots.
The tenants don't want to go into an amenity desert.
Right.
They want to go into an amenity-rich district that they enjoy hanging out and living and being close to where they live.
And maybe running errands in. Yeah, I think it's that flexibility in it.
But if you got a Class B space out in the suburbs that's not near anyone's place of home,
You're just driving out to that suburban desert.
those are not going to make it.
Yes.
You mentioned co-working, Scott. Have you seen examples, an increase in landlords sort of making their own co-working spaces without leasing to a WeWork, just kind of sort of modeling their own sort of flexible spaces after the model of WeWork and other co-working providers? How is that playing out?
Yeah, they'll take their dead space and compete with WeWork by just saying, all right, we've got a block of 3 floors, let's make it co-working. And they'll hire a place like us to come in, spruce them up and make them a relaxed, hospitable environment with some amenities. And there's always a need for those little, small tenants that just can't afford to have all the amenities of a big building unless it's in a WeWork environment. But I think to add on to that, what we've seen is competitive WeWorking type of buildings. It was mentioned some to you, Amber, a little earlier. We have a place called the Ion in Houston. It's a old Sears store, 300,000 square feet. Rice University inherited the building 40 years ago. They've never done it. They finally, being in an ideal part of town, it's called Midtown. It's adjacent to the world's largest medical center, the Texas Medical Center. They built it into an incubator lab of small tenants, basically filled it up in about 12 months. I think it's about 85% leased now.
Yeah. I actually was looking up to tour it, and it is phenomenal.
Pretty cool.
It's very cool. It's got a lot of tech entrepreneurial stuff going on. There was an event when I was there. It was just,
They got
It's
it.
really
They got
impressive.
the 3 floors of the building in a central atrium,
yeah.
which is really great for collaboration. And they're leasing to people like pharma and biotech companies that want to collaborate and do R&D research. That's the main focus. And a similar project that Amber, I think you said you went to, Heinz is building something called the Bioscience and Biolife Building. It's a building on the other side of the Texas Medical Center, doing the same thing, building it ground up. So I would call that a co-working environment.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting on the bioscience topic. I manage the coverage of our Boston market, and in that market, that's obviously the biggest sector for that. But in that market, there's been a lot of examples where these older office buildings get repurposed because there's so much demand for lab. Do you see that as a scalable solution across the country? Do you think we're going to see more old offices going toward labs in other cities besides Boston and Cambridge?
I think that we'll see a little bit of that, but it's so, the life sciences market is very, as far as R&D is concerned, it really does depend on the talent and the core, and that's why you always see so many clusters really have that strength in Boston, Bay Area, and a couple other places too. But Houston, places like Houston, places like RTP has been a huge growth area, but thinking about the adjacencies with the Texas Medical Center, we've seen, the examples that Scott just mentioned, the reason we're seeing that is because there's sort of this emergent demand there. But I think during the pandemic, we saw a lot of investors and developers who were interested in converting to lab spaces. But just like with multifamily, it's got to have the right bones, it has to have the right location. Not everything is conducive to being a lab building, but certainly is one of the more promising sectors. It's just, unfortunately, it's just so niche, so it's not really quite on the precipice of expanding like tech did 10 years ago. But we'll see. I mean, science is certainly.
Well, on a little different tangent, in the energy corridor where those other office buildings are, someone got a bold idea, they would build a co-working space, a couple 100,000 square feet. So what did they do? They built a brand new industrial warehouse building, 400 feet long, big soaring ceilings with skylight down the center, with an atrium, and opened up to a co-working incubation lab. And they're full.
Yeah.
They're getting energy corridor tenants amongst other small little mom and pop operations that just want a place to hang out. It's kind of interesting. But all of that, when you add it up, they took over. Those three projects took over 1 million square feet out of the commercial office market, which is a big deal. I mean, that could have been leased out of a vacancy.
Right, so some of those things are helping bring down the vacancy rate, which has hit historic highs in a lot of different markets.
No, I compounded it.
Yeah,
Because they built a new building, and about 2 were new buildings, and one was I guess a rehab.
Right. So yeah, a lot of the vacancy rate is made up of these, these buildings that are functionally obsolete and aren't really competitive. And you've both said that not every building works for a conversion to residential or to lab. And I mean, so what do you think is going to happen to all those buildings? I mean, it seems like there's going to be a rise in, distressed loan situations and all that. But like the structures of the buildings themselves, if they don't work for a conversion, if they're not competitive as office, I mean, there's a lot of these old structures. What do you guys think is going to happen to all those?
You first.
Okay, I think you're going to have a lot of distressed property that's going to be swooped up at big discount prices, and the people can take a risk that they can buy it low enough to make it work even on a low occupancy. But you're going to see some major distress, reworking loans, buying properties. There are so many investment funds we put together right now that are vulture funds, $1 trillion plus vulture funds. And on top of that, what you tell me was over $1 trillion.
$1.5 trillion of loans that are coming due in the next couple of years. Yeah. But I mean, it's a really hard question to answer because I think everybody wants to know or has ideas about what they think will happen. And I do think that even though we're starting to see some pricing come to bear, it's hard to say in a blanket statement what's going to happen because it is so asset specific, it's so location specific, and it's so hard to predict. What ultimately happens when some of these loans come due. I mean, lenders don't necessarily want to take these assets back, and there's got to be a higher, better use for some of these more functionally obsolete assets. And I think again, cities have a vested interest in figuring out what that looks like. So it's not going to be one simple answer, but I do think that there will be, a little bit of readjustment in the market. Unfortunately, some winners and losers.
There's going to be a big readjustment. There's a 50-story building that's sold. If you were to build this building today, it would be $500 per foot building. It's a Skid Row Merrill building. It was built about 30 years ago. It's a beautiful building. It just sold for $85 a square foot.
Where is this? Oh, geez.
They're all land value.
I think I remember when the building was built.
Yeah, 50% built. So if you take that approach, and that's probably a discount of 20 to 80% discount. Now, if you take that approach, that building can be torn down, you can rebuild on that land, it's probably worth $200 square foot just land value. That's the kind of discount who's going to replace these buildings. Now, that's a beautiful building, it should not be torn down.
So I think there'll be some opportunities for investors just as there is during every downturn.
Seems like it, yeah, there's been a lot of money.
There's a lot of money out there, yeah.
Yes, certainly something we've been covering at Bisnow quite a bit. We've touched on a lot of different aspects of the office market, and our time is getting short. So I want to open it up to the audience. Does anybody else have questions for the panel? Anything you're curious about on the office market right here?
What are the strongest office markets
I was just going to say Miami. In fact, that's one of the markets where we've seen exceed pre-pandemic levels. Think about some of the wealth management firms and financial services firms that kind of expanded or relocated down there. I think a lot of VC money moved down there, the connections to Latin America. It's actually been a very strong market.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A bright spot on the horizon.
Bright, sunny spot in this market. But yeah, I mean, a lot of the Southeast markets, a lot of markets where he does work, there's been a huge migration shift of companies and people over the last 3 years. It's slowing now, but I think that the Sunbelt markets have also been performing fairly well relative to some of the counterparts. Like I think San Francisco has got some challenges. Downtown Los Angeles, where I sit, it has some challenges, but yeah, certainly the sunnier markets have been.
So do you see any other Miamis out there?
RTP in Charlotte, yeah, Charlotte's a great market. So RTP, Raleigh-Durham, really a lot of science and tech and expansion, a lot of manufacturing presence there. So I think any market that has global connectivity and has innovative industries driving it are on pretty solid footing. Despite the consolidation we're seeing in portfolios, I think that there's still a lot going for a lot of those gateways, especially as well. Young people still want to live in big cities, believe it or not. They just maybe don't want to go to the office every day.
Ethan, you have a question?
Yeah. I was wondering when tenants are now like kind of exploring whether they want to do this office deal, are they thinking about the debt on these buildings? Are they thinking about is a bank going to own this in 2 years?
Yeah.
They are thinking, well, and with any tenant landlord situation, you want to know what's going on with your landlord, So I do think that tenants are aware of that because of the news. They're probably not thinking about it as much as, some of the capital markets folks in the industry might be thinking about it. But it certainly has an impact. I mean, as a renter of an apartment building, you want to know that your landlord's going to take care of the maintenance and all the things that are needed. So there are questions about that. But it hasn't become a huge concern or necessarily a decision-making factor because if a tenant's looking at a building that obviously it's in demand. So
There's been a transformational shift in some of the development deals we're seeing. In Austin, we did a really interesting project about 3 years ago, just sold last year. But it was taking a piece of dirt that was 125 by 250 feet, perfect size for a garage. We stacked up 7 floors of the garage, and on top of that, we put 3 layers of office floors, 25,000 square feet floor plate, so it's an office floor plate. And on top of that, 350 apartment units. So it's a stacked, co-located vertical living with retail on the ground floor, an office lobby, residential lobby. And it's in a hip part of town, right in downtown Austin. And it kind of solves the remote working problem, not problem, but challenge. The people in the building can actually co-work in the space that we created, co-working in the building. The office building got the benefit, a real benefit of zero-cost land and zero-cost parking. You use the shared parking formula, which the Austin City codes allow, and they took the office floor plate They took the office floors and created a condominium that the Endeavor Group owned. They signed off on the bank notes. No bank would finance it, but they got guarantees. And then they sold the residential portion, pre-sold, to MetLife, assuming they get full occupancy. The building leased up in less than 5 months, both for the residents and I think in 8 months for the office. They sold it for $950, $25 a square foot. Now, that's a hybrid building. We're doing 2 more. One's under construction in Austin. It's a 50-story building with a little more net window on both office and residential. And we're doing another one in Houston. But right now, banks aren't lending money, so you got to get a lot of private equity. But that's a very transformational shift in the mindset of development.
That's really interesting. Do we have other questions? Okay.
We're talking largely about buildings themselves, but when we're talking about bringing in employees back to the office space, what are some of the design elements that you're seeing? Are people still demanding to not be in cubicles on top of each other? Are they looking for better HVAC systems, some kind of guarantees for their health? I mean, I remember remember at the beginning of the pandemic and during the pandemic, I covered a lot of things of that nature where people just wanted some shift changes, not just for COVID, but for the prevention of the spread of the common flu. I know we've all worked in newsrooms where we spread each germ around that all of our kids have collected from public schools. What are some of the things that, those carrots that you can get people to come back into the office that are just simple design elements?
Well, none of them are simple. I mean, there has been a big emphasis on refiltration of air with HEPA filters, etc. There are health and wellness components for putting in some daycare pieces for people who have childcare at home, at the office. They have fitness floors that are being inserted to serve either the entire building, and it's a discounted fitness that's subsidized by the company, things that are going to promote health and welfare. I think alternative workspaces within the office, and you're talking about large company, they're creating places where if you are in one of those, we call it cubicles, but we have the open work office settings, and those workstations can get on your nerves. So if you have some spaces that they can work alternatively during the day, the younger generation, they love it. And they will go there and hang out there, whether it's the cafe or the barista area, just a lounging area in the lobby. There's just alternative officing opportunity.
Yeah, we've seen a lot of sort of this concept of like we versus we space. So how much of the ratio has shifted from that individual cubicle or private office type space to more of that we space, which is collaboration space, the cafes, sort of, working in a more collegiate way. If you're coming into the office right now, it's because you want to meet with your team, you want to be visible, you need to brainstorm, whatever that is. That requires some collaboration space. So we've seen more of that planned in the office designs that our development group works on, and also the wellness factors, like Scott mentioned. But there's this sort of, when you go to the office, there's got to be this purpose. We already saw the pendulum swinging back before the pandemic against all of these open workplaces. Everyone's got their noise canceling headphones on because you can't really get work done if everybody's right next to you. And I think that has gone by the wayside. I don't think people really like that kind of space anymore. So if you're hoteling or if you're sharing a desk with somebody, I think people want a little bit more space. They want to know that it's clean, but they also want to make sure that they've got enough space to collaborate. And then if they're going to go to the office, it's not going to be a challenge to get in the conference room just so you can meet. Because that's a challenge in my own world sometimes. Like I can't get in the conference room. So yeah, how can you make it conducive so that when you have people back at work, that it's going to be productive and make it worth their commute?
Following up on that question, we also heard a lot about technologies that would, the office owners were implementing, like the touchless access and the building systems and the apps to like sense, where people are in the building. And are you seeing people still use these technologies? What's the latest with that?
Oh, absolutely. But I will say right now, everyone's so cautious about putting improvement dollars in the buildings. It's cooled off.
Yes.
But during post-pandemic right away, everyone was really about touching.
Right.
We had the sanitizer stations in front of every elevator, about no one when pushing the open button. But the automated elevators are really great technology.
Do we have other questions back there?
Hey, John. Yeah. So I have more of a question or comment. I wanted to flag that my group, National Housing Council, and ULI published a report on justice conversation 2 or 3 months ago. And able to, what you're saying about public-private partnership is key to making this work. Is unique financing, vacancy, can be involved there. But we actually did a webinar with some of the folks who worked on it and some developers that did successfully complete these types of projects as case studies, right? How this came together. But one thing that we had on the webinar was a representative from the housing department of the city of Alexandria, Virginia, and so he can speak to just that point of how you have to have these kind of unique fields on a case-by-case basis. So, but it does seem that we're sort of starting to go line.
Totally. I mean, it's in the city's best interest to make sure those tax revenues make sense. They can't just bet on everybody coming back to the office and buying lunch downtown every day like they used to. So there's got to be some solution And I think all of us want cities that are sound and have good infrastructure and that are dynamic and people want to live, work, and play. So it just can't, these downtowns really have to become more dynamic, and I think the city has a vested interest in figuring out what that looks like, or the state, or what have you. But yeah, a lot of opportunity, I think.
The damage done by the pandemic to our downtowns all across America is going to take decades to undo. There are so many small businesses that have been forced out of business in our urban centers. It's really sad. I mean, cities work hard to keep their downtown core areas active, and it's just taking a big toll.
Right there.
So you touched on this a little bit, Amber, but finding a conference room is always such a pain in the ass. And I'm wondering, we have this big beautiful office building in Houston, we did like 2 years before the pandemic, but now I'm like on these Zoom calls, some of the sources are here, and it's like I'm just trying to battle to get a space, and at the same time I'm so used to writing interviews in other silence that it's like annoying.
I feel you.
I love seeing my coworkers. I love talking to journalists and the news culture. But the reality is I personally feel like I'm really active at home for certain types. Obviously not TV, but
Totally.
what are you hearing from companies about how they're trying to reconfigure their current spaces? Maybe not having to do a total renovation, but recognizing that there is a need for more quiet rooms, and also you have some rural diversity, some people that actually they didn't realize that perhaps this whole time that they would have performed better in a quieter setting. And so what do you see in terms of people trying to troubleshoot their current office spaces without
Yeah. Well, one of the challenges is I think companies are hesitant to spend a lot of money right now, but there is this realization that you need to make sure that the physical space matches what the actual work looks like. And to your point, I'm the same way. I'm on Zoom calls all day, so when I'm in my desk at work, we have an open office plan because we haven't redesigned yet. So it's like everybody's on Zoom calls yelling at each other in the corridor. But what we've seen is people are, there's some really modular, cool modular things that you can do that are a little bit more cost effective, like little phone booths or mobile areas. So I know one of my colleagues in New York, whenever she's on the phone or the Zoom with me, I see her in the little phone booth and I can see people walking behind her because it's like a glass booth, which is kind of funny. But I think it's sort of, what are those creative solutions that you can implement quickly that will get your folks feeling productive in the office? Because we've seen in studies that we've done too, that different people have different purposes for being in the office. To your point, if you're gonna be in the office, does it make sense to be in the office if you're gonna be on Zoom calls for 8 hours that day? Or does it make sense to plan your day at the office where you've got some team collaboration, maybe you're doing a lunch, maybe you're meeting with a client, but making it worth its while? And I've done that personally in my own organization of my work life, is making sure if I'm going to downtown LA that I'm not just gonna commute and pay for the parking and then be on calls all day, because I've had coworkers even say to me oh, I've seen you sitting next to me all day, but we haven't even chatted. I'm sorry, I don't want to interrupt you on your call. So there's certain reasons that, certain things that people feel more productive at home, they feel more productive doing sort of focused work in their home office versus, the socialization, the collaboration, the culture, the team building. That certainly is a more productive activity in the office, but having the ability to curate that with your facility, I think companies are starting to implement some of those modular design choices. And then I think planning for longer term workplace transformation. We're hearing a lot more from the larger corporate occupiers right now that they're really taking some strategic action and thinking about it now. They may not be implementing things, but they are certainly planning out what that looks like. So we'll probably see a lot more of these sort of hybrid office designs start to emerge next year and thereafter. Because it does take money, but it also, I think companies want to be really strategic about what they build, especially if it's going to be their office for the next 10 years.
It's really no size fits all. Each company, each workplace is different, and you really have to cater the design solutions to the work that needs to be accomplished.
Well, I think we're over our time here, but thank you, Amber and Scott, for coming in for the conference and sharing all of your insights. It's been really interesting.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah.